Good evening, everyone. It's great to see you all here this evening. My name's Andrew Petter, and I'm the president of Simon Fraser University. Let me begin by acknowledging the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples on whose unceded traditional territory we are privileged to live, work, and play. And this evening, privileged to be able to hear a lecture about First Nations languages. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second lecture in the President's Lecture Series for this year. And I'd like to extend a special welcome to members of First Nations communities, including Haida Elder and Professor Ignace's collaborator, Lawrence Bell, who's with us this evening. Lawrence is from Old Masset in Haida Gwaii. He's the last male fluent speaker of the Masset dialect of Haida. And we're very honored, Lawrence, you could be here this evening. So thank you very much for joining us. And thank you for joining us at SFU's vibrant downtown campus for what promises to be a stimulating evening and a stimulating opportunity to hear from a speaker who's going to, I know, both inform us and hopefully stimulate some excellent questions and comments from the audience. This year, SFU, as I hope you know, is celebrating our 50th anniversary. We're also celebrating our commitment to be Canada's most community-engaged research university, and this President's Faculty Lecture Series, part of SFU Public Square, is very much a commitment that reflects our vision to be an engaged university. We want to provide you, as members of the community, with opportunities to hear from and engage with our leading research faculty. And by doing so, we hope that we can help to foster enlightenment and promote dialogue on important issues of the day. There will be a chance following the lecture to raise some questions or offer some comments. And we also will have an informal and not too expensive reception afterwards, where you're welcome to stay, have a cup of coffee, and our speaker has kindly agreed to stay as well and carry on some informal conversation. Please also note the lecture will be filmed for and available on our SFU YouTube channel, so if you do ask a question, you may end up on the tube. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Marianne Ignace. Dr. Ignace is Professor of Linguistics and First Nations Studies at SFU. She's also director of our First Nations Language Center. She originally came to SFU to study her PhD on Haida discourse and social organization. This ignited a lifelong passion to study, teach, and preserve First Nations language and culture. Her interests include First Nations narrative and oral history, language and culture, ethnobiology and ethnoecology, Aboriginal peoples and languages of the Northwestern North America, and she's published widely on these themes. For the past 20 years, Dr. Ignace has worked extensively with the Shuswap Nation, studying land use, traditional ecological knowledge, and of course, linguistics. In 1988, she co-founded SFU's satellite campus in Kamloops that operated on Kamloops Indian Band land and featured courses on First Nations language, culture, and history. Although the campus closed in 2010, some of the coursework continues to be offered. Since 2013, Dr. Ignace has been leading a $2.5 million, 7-year Social Science and Humanities Research Council partnership project to stem the tide of First Nation language loss in BC and Yukon. She's brought together 23 First Nations groups and community language practitioners with academic researchers to document and preserve languages and produce new tools and resources for language learning. The emerging best practices for local language revitalization may also be applicable to the revival of other endangered languages, not only in North America, but around the world. I'm sure you will agree with me, based on this description and the lecture to follow, that Dr. Ignace very much reflects what it means to be an engaged researcher. And we're very fortunate to have her with us this evening to share her insights on the topic, why First Nations languages matter. So please join with me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Dr. Marianne Ignace.
Good evening. I would like to join Andrew in acknowledging the local Coast Salish First Nations on whose lands we are. My talk tonight, as you can see, is why First Nations languages matter. And as you've heard, it's something that I have, as an academic, taught and practiced and lived for the past, actually 35 years or so now, since I was just a young kid, went to Haida as a graduate student. And it's also a topic that, as a community member in a First Nations community in the interior, in the Secwepemc Nation, I have experienced, and as a parent. So it's not just a field of academic study for me. And as a community member and parent, I have experienced all the bumps and bruises that go with this really difficult field of keeping indigenous languages alive. Before I move on to tell you a little bit more about myself and then the topic, I would like to acknowledge the many elders in First Nations communities throughout BC and Yukon that I've had the privilege in the last 30 years or so to work with. And there are many more. These are only a few of them in this collage. From the Haida Nation, from the Nukhalk Nation, Secwepemc people, and Tsimshian people. And this picture is a bit, or this collage is a bit symbolic for me. Every single one of them has left us, is no longer with us. But they have left an amazing legacy of the knowledge of their diverse languages that they have shared with us. So I just want to tell you a little bit more about myself. I was born and raised in northwest Germany in a European, what is now called minority language community at the edge of Saterland, Friesland, and Emsland. And my parents and grandparents, and as we've traced our family back through several hundred years, never moved. They always stayed, and probably stayed there in the previous several thousand years, never taking part in any of those big population movements. And as I've, in the last couple of decades, brought my husband, Ron, who is Secwepemc, and my family over there, I've kind of come to experience and interpret the life of my own ancestors through indigenous eyes, if you want. But that's kind of a different topic, perhaps down the line. So I began life and work in the Haida community of Old Masset 35 years ago, where I was adopted into the Au Yahkulanas clan as Gulqishgat. And then I moved kind of through a fluke into the interior in the mid-1980s and began research and married and raised a family in the Secwepemc community. And in the late 1990s, after I had raised a young family, Secwepemc elders called me back, Haida elders called me back to come help document and teach the language to younger generations. And I've also been privileged since about 1998 to have worked with Samalgar speakers in the Tsimshian Nation through work that is ongoing. And I'm really honored to have my friend and colleague, Debbie Layton-Stevens, here tonight with me. So my interest as an academic and my passion is at the intersection of language and culture, how language reflects and embeds cultural knowledge, wisdom, protocols, and practice. And what that also means is how speakers of particular languages, in stories, in sometimes song, in narrative of other kinds, in speeches and oratory, deploy linguistic forms to say things in an appropriate, interesting, poetic, rhetorical way, or sometimes humorous way. Many of you probably know that the province that we live in, find ourselves in now, British Columbia, is something like a hotbed of linguistic diversity within Canada and Western North America. We have here in BC some, depending how you count them, 32 or so languages representing 59 dialects within those languages. And those languages are also not from a single language family by far, but they comprise 8 different linguistic families. And so what that means is a language like Samalgach is as different from Haida as Japanese might be from Hungarian, and again as different from interior Salish languages as French might be from Turkish. So we have then even though people have lived side by side between Haida Gwaii and the Tsimshian Nation just across Hecate Strait, or between the Secwepemc and Chilcotin Nation to our northwest, for hundreds and hundreds of years and intermarried, but the languages have stayed separate. Within this wonderful linguistic diversity, we're finding ourselves at a critical time. And this is a situation that languages in BC share with indigenous languages across North America and, in fact, globally. The prediction is of the somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 indigenous languages in the world, all but a couple of hundred might face extinction within the next 100 years. And here in British Columbia, this is a particularly critical time. The chart here that I have copied is from a report by the First Peoples Heritage, Language and Culture Council from 2010. And if you look at the blue line here, it shows you what the decline is. Back in 2010, only just over 5% of First Nations people in British Columbia could still speak their language. And because the vast majority of those people are elderly, annually that number is declining. So turn the clock, and we're in 2015 now, and that number of who are first language speakers of their language has gone down to less than 2%. And, but at the same time, even though that is a terribly gloomy and sobering thought and situation that nonetheless we have to live, there is hope. If you take the orange line here, one way of stemming the tide of language loss is to replace fluent speakers with younger people of childbearing age who will not only know their language but also use it and then again transmit it to the next generations. So there is hope to do that, but it's a daunting task. I think most of you, if not all of you, know the reasons for this decline. Definitely residential schools, which in Canada were compulsory between the 1920s and the late 1960s, quite literally beat Indigenous languages out of at least 3 generations of children. But even when residential schools closed their doors in the late 60s, the provincial government, as it then took on the education of First Nations children, did not think for one moment at that time, when we still had many speakers of younger and middle age, to introduce bilingual education, to open bilingual schools for First Nations students. And of course, there has been the pervasive influence of English in the workplace and public. And English by Indigenous people throughout North America has often been called a killer language because it becomes so hard to maintain niches of speaking and using Indigenous languages. And I'd also like to remind you that the situation is very different than a situation for minority heritage languages, which might have just some dispersed speakers in Canada or North America. We don't have a homeland where we can send our kids to become immersed in the language. Our Indigenous homelands where we live is all we have. And with a dwindling number of speakers, it's very hard to expose younger generations to a language being spoken fluently by all. Oops. Is it stuck? There Just on the topic of residential schools, because we've had the preliminary results of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission just in the past year. This testimony up top there, I was punished quite a bit because I spoke my language. I was put in a corner and whipped, and sometimes I was just given bread and water, or they tried to embarrass us and put us in front of the whole class. This is a statement from a former student at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, pictured on the left, which for a number of years was the largest Indian residential school in the country. And we've had, since then, the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, which unfortunately never took on a mandate of dealing with language loss, the Government Apology and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which referred to what happened as cultural genocide, but it definitely included, in a very important fashion, linguicide. When it comes to what is lost, when a language becomes extinct, we have to remind ourselves that a language includes and expresses cultural knowledge and wisdom, ways of organizing thought, connection with land and environment that has been accumulated over thousands of years. Knowing one's language connects to identity, one's history, ancestors, one's stories. And there's been some research also that loss of language is related to health issues in the wider sense of physical, spiritual, emotional, and mental health. But we also have, in the past decade or two, some, and even before, for the last 50 years, we've had interesting research on the cognitive benefits of bilingualism and multilingualism. Although we must keep in mind that the parents of children who either still went to residential schools or then were part of the public school system were well into recent decades, if not years, told, learn English, have your kids learn English, forget about your language, it's going to keep them back. And that kind of language ideology, while in the research community it became outdated several decades ago, it has lingered on among educators, parents, and so forth. And another thing that kind of gives us pause to think, we know from research, and I'll show you a couple more slides here, about the fact that knowing more than one language is actually a cognitive benefit in more than one way. But when it comes to special needs education in Canada, in fact in North America, the assumption has been that special needs education is automatically English only, instead of actually taking advantage of the ways that exposure and learning of one's own indigenous language can build and restore cognitive skills. It's a hard task, but nonetheless, it's worth exploring. One important piece of research is the work that Alan Bialystok from the University of Toronto has done in the past 2 decades or so. This just highlights a few of her findings published in a number of research articles. Among the cognitive benefits of bi- or multilingualism, which of course includes also knowing or learning one's indigenous language, not just French and English or Spanish or Mandarin. It increases metalinguistic awareness. So in other words, individuals who learn more than one language have better creative problem solving. Bilinguals outperform monolinguals in reading ability. Bilinguals develop advantages in executive functions of the brain, such as problem solving, mental flexibility, attention control, inhibitory control, task switching. In other words, can stay better focused on tasks. And children who participate in immersion programs to varying degrees showed the same tendencies towards developing executive brain functions and metalinguistic abilities that had been reported for children who were raised bilingually in the home. And finally, bilingualism can slow the onset of dementia in Alzheimer's patients for as long as 5 years. So I think this could be something that is also important for the growing number of middle-aged and elderly First Nations adults that we have, that it's good to learn your First Nations language. We've had some recognition of formal institutions of this. So the 2009 report of the Canadian Council on Learning acknowledged that knowledge of ancestral language is key to how Aboriginal people view learning, a process that, that is lifelong and extends well beyond the classroom, and so on and so forth. But the downside is, within a wider legal context, it's a pretty mixed field right now. We have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which includes 3 articles that particularly confirm the right to one's language, the right to education in a language, the right to media in an indigenous language. We do not have the legal recognition of Aboriginal languages in Canada. We have Section 35, but interestingly, the right to language has not been tested in court so far, and so I've listed it as a maybe. Not that Indigenous people don't feel and think that this is a right. Remember, the box is full, not empty, but from a legal point of view, this has not been tested. We have in British Columbia the First Peoples Heritage, Language and Culture Act from 1996, which has mandated some expenditure for First Nations languages through a variety of funding projects, but it really is dwarfed by the amount of funding that is available for French language and bilingualism. We have other jurisdictions like the Northwest Territories that recognize Aboriginal languages, and more recently Nunavut, which since it came out with its official recognition of Inuktitut in the territory, has come out with a very strong language commission and a variety of programs in their resourcing. So there is some hope around legal recognition, but it's a difficult situation in BC. And we don't have, for example, within the BC School Act, any legal recognition of Indigenous languages or First Nations languages either. So I've already talked about the cognitive, health, identity, cultural benefits of learning and knowing an Indigenous language. There's also been some very interesting recent research into the connection between language and cognition. Some of you, if you went to university many, many years ago, probably heard about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and the connection between language, culture, and thought. And it was shrugged off for some decades as unprovable, among other things. But through the Max Planck Institute and other academic researchers in the last decades or so, there have been some very interesting projects into linking the way individuals actually cognitively perceive and organize the world as through a particular language. And so that gives us some indicators that there is something to that. We have also, from the point of view of Indigenous peoples, many statements and testimony of how important a language is, that it connects to identity. As one of our Haida elders was saying, if we don't have our language, what do we even call ourselves? Who are we even? And the Royal Commission, the RCAP from 1996, came out with this statement that's on here, and you have many others. Linguists, for example, have throughout the past decades have made connections between the cultural value of languages. Some of you have probably heard the late Ken Hale's famous statements of allowing Indigenous languages to die is like throwing a bomb on the Louvre, using a very kind of strong metaphor there. And there have also been the statements, but also increasing research on the connection between language and environment, and between linguistic diversity and biodiversity. So Peter Mühlhäusler coined the following statement: life in a particular human environment is dependent on people's ability to talk about it. With First Nations languages having become critically endangered as a result of the factors identified above, many have lost this powerful and detailed ability to speak about their land in their indigenous language, a language which embodies many types of ecological knowledge, from vocabulary and stories of habitats to botanical features and to the species themselves and to the ecological connections between species. So given what we know about the connection between indigenous language, land, cultural, and biodiversity, this loss is all the more tragic and devastating. So with the loss of the language, we will lose at least that particular way, and often very intricate way, of talking about the environment. And that way of talking about it also, as many indigenous people have said, encapsulates thousands of years of living on the land. From the point of view of a particular language, there are also aspects of the language that become flat or that are lost as people don't speak it anymore. So we're losing registers of speech. We're losing the ability to tell elaborate stories as opposed to reading them, to make oratory in a language, all the different complex ways of interacting politely in a language, making conversation. We're losing parts of the lexicon, words that are no longer in use by current generations. We're also using parts of the grammatical structure, the ability to make complex sentences that describe people and their interactions or the land. One of our linguist colleagues from the University of Hawaii, Bill O'Grady, gave a very interesting paper at a language documentation conference a couple of years ago, noting that it's not enough to just understand languages, but if all learners are just learning languages at a basic level, then future generations will no longer be able to make complex grammatical sentences that include the ifs and whens, the ought to, the maybe, the could have been and should have been, and the ways that we know from what evidence of what's happened, and so on and so forth. And some of those translate into particular linguistic forms of how we track a topic in a language, how we use particles in the language, like classifiers, to identify shapes and forms in the world, and how we can use language as metaphor, making puns and jokes, using a language in a poetic way. So that has been a long kind of preface to some of the examples that I will show you. So I'm going to particularly talk about two indigenous languages that I've been close to in the last decades, Hatkil Haida on the one hand and Secwepemctsín on the other. And I will kind of approach it from a point of view that what Edward Sapir back in 1921 called the genius of language, how particular languages encapsulate and have very interesting and unique ways of expressing knowledge about the world. So I'm going to talk about Hatkil first, as you probably know, spoken on Haida Gwaii, and its homeland is not only Haida Gwaii, but also southeastern Alaska. Most people identify it as a linguistic isolate. In other words, a language that is not related to any other language on the earth. When Haida Hatkil goes, there goes everything that goes with it. There's no other language that's sort of like it that is still spoken. Although there's some interesting research also. We know from archaeological work that Haida Gwaii has had human occupation for 14,000, 15,000 years. And although Haida people over many thousands of these years have had interchange, intermarriage, trade, and interrelationships with people on the mainland. Nonetheless, the language has stayed separate and unique. There's some evidence that long time ago, probably 10,000 years or more, it may have had origins that are similar to Tlingit, but we just don't know. It's so long. The English language, as we know it now, is not even 2,000 years old, so that's much longer than the kind of years that we deal with in European languages. We're fortunate, though. Did I miss a slide? So just on the language itself, there are 3 dialects: Masset, Skidegate, and Alaskan. And the language was fairly well documented going back to the early 1900s by a student of Franz Boas, John Swanton. And since the mid-70s into the 90s, had another linguist, John Enrico, working on it, who produced a prolific dictionary and 2-volume syntax. In terms of the number of speakers, Hatkil, or Haidakil, as the Skidegate dialect has it, is not in a good situation. We have what are probably 4 to 5 fluent first language speakers left of the Masset dialect, and somewhere an equal number in Skidegate, 1 or 2 in Alaska. And over the past 3 years, as I've gone back every month or two to Haida Gwaii, often with Lawrence, we have lost 2 male speakers and 1 female speaker, all over 90. And as Andrew said earlier, Lawrence is the last male speaker of the Masset dialect. He literally doesn't have any male to talk to anymore to speak his language, other than us learners or some younger males who are learning the language. But that's a difficult situation. And the loss then in an indigenous community of who are the last few people who live and work with students is tragic and devastating, and it really takes a toll. But nonetheless, we have a group of about a dozen younger people that are kind of through a number of different ways of courses and master apprentice work and a boot camp we did last year, now learning the language. So yeah, this is Swanton's work, and he left a wonderful legacy of some 300 narratives in Hatkil, recorded in a period of just under a year with what was then elders, fluent speakers of the language in the year 1900, 1901. And when I first began my dissertation research in the late 1970s, actually I had some focus on trying to figure out what this wealth of Swanton's texts actually was. And at the time, I was fortunate to be adopted and lived in the household of Emma Matthews, who was born in 1894, and also worked closely with Lana Stung Adam Bell, who was a couple of years younger. He was the last trained orator in the Haida language. And I could basically, once I had familiarized myself with the sound system of the language and figured out the orthography, I could pretty much read them to Emma, and she could comment on them and make them out. So they're of high quality. So I wanted to tell you a little bit more about the genius of Hatkil. So we have a large inventory of consonants, as indigenous languages throughout northwestern North America all have. We have a 2-tone system of a high and a low tone, which actually makes it quite difficult for learners. So you might have a word like Kwaye, which is the word for a rock, and you have a word that sounds very similar, Kwaye, which is the word for rope. So they have nothing to do with one another, and it has to do with how you maneuver the tone. And it's a polysynthetic language which is the most interesting part of it. Most of the important information in Hatkil is contained in the verb. And so this gives you a little bit of, there's a whole set of some 40 what we call instrumentals. They are the means by which an action is carried out. So for is by hitting something with a compact object, like a rock. You can key something by poking at it, so like with a spear or just in that kind of motion. It doesn't have to be anything violent. You can skro something by pushing with your hands. You can sta something by stepping on it or trampling, or you can kick it with a sta. There's an interesting one, o, which is by way of your butt or body weight. And I'll show you an example from that in a second. And it also has culturally relevant, important ones. Hu, by blowing, which is onomatopoetic. There's a lot of blowing going on of winds in Haida-Gwaii. There are dal is another one that it's movement by way of the tide. And also one that can be adapted, khul, which is by combustion. So khulqa is you go by, ka is going, and khulqa you go by a motor vehicle of some kind. Another really interesting set of particles, these all go in front of the verb, are lexical classifier or shape prefixes. There's some 36 in a set of others, and they combine with instrumentals to create complex images of shapes that act on one another. So there's like ska, spherical, ska, a cylindrical shape, tau, a flared stick like a feather or a spoon. Ska is an extended shape, so it can be a rope, but a song is also thought of as a rope-like thing that carries on. And others for sheets or cloth. Ta is one for something that's thin and flat. So if we need to make up coin a new word for something like an egg flipper, the word that we use is kitljulangwe, because you make a poking motion on a flat object and you julang it, and the way in the end is the instrument. So you can very creatively actually coin new words out of these existing pieces. They also show you some interesting sort of cognitive aspects. The classifier ska is used for objects with protrusions, which includes tables, anchors, crabs, frogs, and eyeglasses that are combined together in a class. The classifier skos are tangled objects that are sort of not rigid. So it can be a pile of kelp on the beach, but it can also be a messy beard or a man's beard. And it can be a number of other things that you could find either on the beach or on people's heads and so forth. And onto the verb also go directionals. And there are lots of those, and they're quite different from English. They include motions into something, up or down, out of something, across an inlet or across a road. But there are also some that are very sort of culturally connected, as down to the beach, up into the woods. And so when in narratives, the actions of people or sometimes supernatural beings and animals and so forth are described, they usually include not just the action itself, but the directionals. So you can actually, from the Haida in the story, you can get very precise kinds of information of in what direction is the movement taking place. The people don't just go, but the going is connected to the mode in which you go and to the type of creature that goes, let alone then the direction in which you go. So all this goes in front of the verb, and then you have a whole number of inflectional suffixes that go behind the verb stem. So those include auxiliaries, always, habitually, probably. So here's an example of that. They probably won't be dancing all the time is all one long verb in Hatkil. And so this is how storytellers then deploy these in complex verbal images. We have a story of, if you have been to Haida Gwaii, Toe Hill, Tao, who has, it's a story about how he took off from his brother who was up the inlet, up Masset Inlet, and then eventually by walking around the coast, he settled in the place that he's now. And Tao, being a rock or a mountain or a cliff, obviously doesn't walk. So the actions of Tao in the story are described as various types of, well, how do you translate it? Butt shuffling, like with the core of his rock. He either slowly moves, or he takes off, or he slows down. And so the whole motion is kind of visualized as a rock actually moving around. And another example of how these are used in stories, this is a story about the oyster catcher. It's actually a story about the north wind and the southeast. And the oyster catcher is the southeast daughter who then has to go to her father-in-law's house. And when she cries out to her father, she's simultaneously crying and calling out, which is the verb up here, "Aikiagang edan." She cried and called out to her father. So you can combine these into just a single verb, as opposed to having to connect them as separate parts of a sentence. And we also have really interesting metaphorical language of how these and sometimes words are deployed. This is a song.
Haladuna, haladuna, tidlukakiladuna.
So this is a song from a story where the man, upon finding his dead brother, makes references. They're sort of just these allegoric pieces that are thrown in. As property for those who are in the house, they used to say, in the corner he is sitting propped up, which refers to the old way of burials, or a wake. Brother's soul has been taken away like the way a bird of prey grabs something. And I think I have to move on to my Secwepemctsín part. One interesting thing, though, with Lanastang Lawrence's father is when we were analyzing and translating his stories, he used English, and you see all the highlighted parts here where he knew the Haida words for these, like hunting, that's a very common word, and the southeast wind is at everybody's tip of the tongue. It's just gone home guide one. They got home guided. And so he wove them into his story. He was a first language speaker of Hatkil, but they were high words to him, the English words. And so he thought of them as very fancy words that he could kind of deploy in his story to impress the young anthropologist, I guess. So I have a few minutes to just tell you about another project that I've been working on. This is Secwepemctsín, my home language. It's an interior Salish language spoken in the south central interior. We're fortunate to have more speakers than Hatkil. Between 17 communities, there are about 100 speakers left. They're all in their, I would say, 70s and over. And some of the 17 communities actually don't have speakers either, so it's a bit of an uneven picture depending on what kind of particular social history communities have had. And I've had the fortune to work together with a group of elders from my community, Skitchison, which is west of Kamloops. And that's our group. A couple of years ago, two of them have actually left us since, and two others are not doing well health-wise. And so we, in the Secwepemc Nation, we have not been fortunate to have somebody like a Swanton who actually verbatim wrote down recorded stories from elders. We've had various linguist or anthropologist James Tate, who was sent by Franz Boas in the early 1900s. Boas himself did a little bit of research. And Tate himself collected a large body of stories, but he wrote them out in English. He never actually wrote the Secwepemctsín. And they're fairly detailed and interesting, but they're written in his own Victorian prose of the 1890s, 1900s. But I was really fortunate to work with a lady on the left bottom there, Mrs. Ida William, whose grandfather was actually one of Tate's consultants, so she could tell some of those stories in her language. We've had Art Kuipers, who passed away a couple of years, working on Secwepemc stories. And he left a really amazing body of about 30, 40 narratives, some of them very detailed that he recorded verbatim with speakers and analyzed. But he was very focused on the linguistics of the language alone. I still remember he once told me that there are no extra-linguistic explanations for linguistic phenomena. So that was his way of thinking of language, but he was a brilliant linguist. And I'm just going to zip through some of these a little bit. So what we've done with the elders in Skitcheston is a project of writing stories. In other words, going back to the versions we have in English only from Tate, and while we still have speakers, to actually turn them into Secwepemc stories. And so this is not just translation, but this is actually putting our collective thinking caps on to figure out what's actually going on here. What is that story about? What are they saying? And what are they doing? And then turning it into the best possible Secwepemctsín prose. So I'm just going to go through some of these. So it's kind of a reclaiming of narratives kind of work. And we do this very democratically as a group with a whiteboard. Lately more also with a PowerPoint projector, and lots of wiping out and re-saying and haggling over how exactly it should be said in the language. And so this is some of the result here. This is one of the little stories of Owl and Chipmunk that's in the Tate collection. Chipmunk lived with his father Owl, and it's a story about a pun. You can read what he says to him there. He says, your scrotum has many lines and is much wrinkled. And Owl says, what did you say? And he quickly says, oh, these bearberries have many lines on them and are much wrinkled. And so getting puns back is a challenge. What would little Chipmunk, who, by the way, is not a he, it's a she, because she always turns up as a she, what would she have said in Secwepemctsín that made this such a parallel line? And that's what she said. So it relies on the two lines of whatever is wrinkled, in one case being kinnikinnick and in the other one being something else, being almost identical. And that's how punning in stories takes place. So that was really neat to get it back. And the other story that we embarked on is quite an epic transformer story about Tlisa and his brothers. And my husband, Ron, and I have actually, in the last decade or so, we've had a bit of a fixation on the Tlisa epic, of him first through his doctoral dissertation from 2008. And we have kind of combined the archaeological context with the oral history, even with some physical anthropology, and with the geological and environmental history, and it sort of all maps on each other, that this is probably stuff that actually took place about 4,500 years ago during what archaeologists call the Loch Nor phase, when a number of people went on a journey. So you could call it the Secwepemc Odyssey. And so they then the brothers vanquish various kind of people, and all of them contain kind of ecological knowledge. Here they beat out a snake woman who has snakes coming out of every one of her orifices with pine cones. And as the reason for pine cones is that they contain turpentine. And snakes don't like the turpentine and pine cones. So they don't throw them at her, but they put basically a bed of pine cones on the ground. And many of them connect to landmarks that we had to find in Secwepemc territory that are still alive. As one of our elders said, the one on the right-hand side, which is about a goat and a dog, it's right above the Husky station at Cache Creek. Don't you see it? And so it was bringing place names back. Or another one is the Painted Chasm at Clinton, which is the site of vanquishing a beaver. And Marble Canyon on the way between Cache Creek and Lillooet, which is the site of vanquishing an eagle. And finally, High Bar Canyon, which is where the brothers were frozen into stone. And the arrows show the places that are still there, but we had to find them. And the work has also contained some really interesting recovering of vocabulary, of lexicon, seeing that this is a historical epic, a story that actually took place. Much of it is the knife that Tli'sa uses. And we have several words for knife in Secwepemc. Well, which one? What kind of knife would he actually use? And so we could, by way of looking at some of the Loch-Nor-phased knives, we could kind of figure out what knife is it. One episode is about tobacco, and the vanquishing a tobacco tree, as Elder Lily Harry from Dog Creek had told Nancy Turner and myself back in 1991. Our real tobacco is actually not Nicotiana. Our tobacco is sumac. And that made a lot of sense around the tobacco tree being explained as blood red in the story. So it connected us to a lot of vocabulary that was in a way becoming lost and nailing down the content of what parts of the story are. I'm just going to skip over this one here. So we then, with this particular one, the Tli'sa epic, arrived at a 27-page text in Secwepemc. And it's also interesting from a point of view of linguistic analysis or narrative analysis. Number one, we uncovered and discovered many new words, but we also figured out some so far not well explained linguistic phenomena in the language. Secwepemc has a way of, if you want to call it, you could call it a switch reference system. Another way of talking about it perhaps is how people organize information in paragraphs as to from whose point of view and perspective does something take place. And in Secwepemc, as in some other Salish languages, the passive voice is used a whole lot in those. And so we've kind of figured out then how, if you track the use of active voice and then it switches to passive voice and carries on over several sentences. So it's not that Tli'sa beat the beaver, but the beaver got beaten by Tli'sa. That's how you have to say it, because that portion of the story is told from the beaver's point of view. And then it switches to where the next portion of the story is told from Tli'sa's point of view. And then perhaps it switches to the brother who becomes the focus. And so it gave us lots of sort of narrative or text to experiment with that and have the elders then guide that as to when do you use the passive, when don't you use it. And another one is sort of nailing down more the use of what we call evidentials in Secwepemc. We have 3 evidentials. If a word or a verb is 0 marked, it means that information is from experience. So if I say chuntes my, if I'm a girl, my sister fixed her house, and I add nothing onto this first word here, the chrintes, it's a 0, then that means I was there. I know from experience she fixed her house. If I add the suffix unke, so as in chrintesenke, I know from evidence. I see that the roof is new, maybe the windows are painted and so forth, so it has a different status of evidence than the other one. And I can yet use a third one. I can use the ending uka, which is hearsay information. So if I say chrintes uka it's I know that she fixed her house because somebody told me. So it has a different status of evidence. And so then we were actually able to track in a running constructed narrative, how do you use them? Not just from the point of view of deciphering them, but so the verdict on that was Enke, by according to evidence, and the 0 marked one, experienced knowledge, are always marked, but Uka is not always marked. It's only marked in connection with the passive and type of constructions when it introduces a new paragraph. So we have some kind of interesting stuff that we can add to what we know linguistically about the language. And I just want to finish off with another just little really neat piece of information. There is a story also. We don't have a man in the moon, but we have a lady or girl in the moon. And if you look at the moon, maybe you'll look at him, because he is a he in the Secwepemc story. This is her head, and she sits kind of crouched down, and she has a birch bark basket on her back, and she has, as it is described, a birch bark shovel in front of her. And we were going, what is a birch bark shovel? Nobody had seen a birch bark shovel. But one of the elders then remembered that because she melts snow with it, she scoops it up. This is, our old-timers used to have these scoopers, and it was a sheet of birch bark, and what they would do is they would kind of gather it up on one end, and then they would scorch it on that end. And so then they had sort of almost like a fan, kind of a scooper, and that's what they used. And we used to call that klofkaten. So that explained also what that shape is, in a way. And it then kind of harkened back. I've just recently been editing a volume of Secwepemc ethnobotany with my colleague Nancy Turner. And my other colleague, George Nicholas, from the archaeology department at SFU, wrote a very interesting article about birch bark in ancient archaeological sites and hearths. But the one puzzle he couldn't unlock was, why are so many of them scorched? They're birch bark shovels. Okay, so thank you.
I'll moderate some questions.
Sure. Yeah.
So Marianne has very kindly agreed to respond to any questions or comments that people have, and I'll do my best to try to pick out. We probably won't be able to do everyone, but we'll try to take a few. And she's got a microphone, so she should be able to be heard from over there. And Heather's going to go around. It's important that you get a microphone before you ask the questions so that when it's webcast, people can hear the question as well as the response. Who wants to pose a question or offer a comment in response to a fascinating lecture about an important but daunting endeavor to try to understand and protect indigenous languages? Right over here in front, Heather. If you could just say who you are and ask the question, that would be great.
Sure, Evelyn Pinkerton. Wonderful talk, Marianne. And I wondered, could you say something more about what it takes to bring back a language. Because, of course, linguists used to tell us years ago that once you only have so many speakers, a language is doomed. And, of course, we have examples like Israel, where people started speaking Hebrew, who didn't speak Hebrew before. So there seem to be some conditions under which the linguists aren't correct. And I just wondered if you've had instances in your studies to reflect on some of the other elements that it takes to, I mean, how do you create political will? Are there a certain number of conditions that have to be in place that really help a language being brought back? I mean, more speakers of a language. You mentioned that young people are learning. Can you tell us anything more about what it takes or what it might take?
Well, I think, in the end, what it will take and what it's taking, the verdict is out as we live this. But I think there's some very exciting and interesting work and projects going on, some of them that we're in touch with through the Shirk Partnership Grant. First of all, I think the example of Hebrew in Israel it's a difficult one. I mean, it took a nation state and with all its institutions to do that. Hebrew really never died before because it kept alive through religion and so forth. But it tells us also, if you have political autonomy and the will, you can do it, right?
Maybe you have to be surrounded by enemies as well.
And whatever it takes, right? I, at some point, had this sort of dream that, okay, if 10 years, 20 years down the road, all 250 people in my community can talk Secwepemctsín again, then, that'll be good. Turn the clock 20 years later. It hasn't happened, not in that way. So that's one way to look at it. But I think I see there's an amazing amount of talent among younger, in some cases, not so young people in our communities who won't take no for an answer. And we have some really neat initiatives. There's some vibrant mentor or master apprentice learning going on. Not hundreds of people per community, but a few. And if you have 5 speakers, and in the next 5 years, 5 people train to become really good in the language, you're actually holding your own, right? It doesn't mean suddenly there's a radical shift to the language becoming used in all walks of life and conversation, but at least it has a life. Maybe somebody would say palliative care, but I don't think that's what those young people think about it. And that's not what I think about it. And we have some really neat stuff too, what I think our young colleague from Squamish, Khalilsam, is not here, but one of his collaborators is. There she is. And they have launched a language house kind of initiative to bring a group of people together to just through immersion learn the language. And in 2 years, you can get pretty good. A postdoctoral fellow that I'm supervising, Michelle Johnson, is doing the same for Nchilachjan Okanagan. I have 2 kids who are in their early 20s doing intensive master mentor apprentice learning. So, and we have throughout our communities many examples. So there is something happening.
Shiraz, right here.
Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge. My question is about non-indigenous people. What role can they play? Because I love learning languages, and I know Cree has been taught by different people, and so are they going to be kind of main languages which non-indigenous people can learn? And my second question is about the songs, because I come from Africa. Even people might have a national language, but they keep on having the local languages through music, songs, and fusion. Thank you.
Yeah. First of all, I think different than sort of large heritage languages, First Nations communities, I think, very much think of the cradles of their languages being their homelands and communities. And I think that's important. And those are unceded homelands by and large, right? And of course, there is also some legacy of appropriation of outsiders in the past having come in and taken the stories, whether for profit or just to put their name on them. And so we do have stories in our communities of those unpleasant and legacied experiences. It's also because the identity and cultural connection and the homeland of those languages are connected to particular indigenous peoples and communities, then if we have a scenario where the language is taught or learned by, let's say, a few Secwepemc and 5,000 non-Secwepemc, it wouldn't feel right. So I think that sort of sense that it is connected to that particular indigenous identity is ongoing, and it's there for a reason. Many of our communities at the same time, if they have a guest in our house, in our homelands, who in a respectful and good way comes forth to help, but that's important, in a respectful and good way. That we need all the hands on deck to do that kind of work. But I think, I don't know, maybe some of you from First Nations communities want to say something more about that. I think those are kind of premises that we need to function on.
And the role of songs?
And the role of songs, I think throughout in First Nations communities, there has been a wonderful revival and comebacks of singing, drumming, performance, and all those things. And it's easier to learn singing than it is to learn your language. But they're also, like we've noticed this in Haida Gwaii, as we've kind of, through the story work that we've done between Lawrence and I, many songs are actually connected to stories. And initially, the songs are sung in such a way that the lyrics are not really there anymore. But so the language itself is also a great way then to take the singing to another language, to another level, that it really brings back the language.
Another question? I'll go to the back there if we have a microphone. Avril, do you have a microphone? Yeah, right over there, wherever. Good.
Hi, my name is Marianne. I'm a linguist. I did research on one of the most ancient languages, Zoroastrian, and I kind of don't believe that English language is a killer. I'm really grateful that the official language of the country is English. Anyone from any part of the world can learn it within a short period of time, but there is no ban or suppression on any of First Nation languages. For example, it could be promoted through world languages in many universities or colleges and institutes, and if that's the purpose, and I don't see that government should be blamed for that, because government is a service provider. So linguistically, there are so many opportunities to promote First Nation languages. And I want to draw your attention that in official ceremonies, always the first welcoming is in First Nations. So as a researcher, I would like to ask you that just kind of the tone of antagonism towards English is a little extreme. So I want to tell you this one. But the body of your the presentation was actually contradicting the introduction. So I agree with that cognitive benefits of knowing several languages. And the next point that you might find it useful
you can come quickly to the question, because we have many other people who want to ask, and we only have a lot of time.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want to respond, Marianne?
Yeah, I think that legacy of what happened to our languages is not that easily going away. And I think the words that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission put to it recently, at least finally kind of got the words right, sort of. And I have seen this in my family, I've seen this in my community, and in the many other communities I work in. People have suffered having their language taken away from them. And we can't just go to it with a blank slate and say, oh, just like the multicultural legislation in Canada did in the 70s, it's all okay now, celebrate your culture and sing and dance, but don't ever look back. And I think there needs to be reconciliation with that.
I just add that the acknowledgement of cultural genocide was agreed to by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, and apologies have been issued, I'm not sure how effectively, but at least in acknowledgement by the Government of Canada for residential schools and other activities taken by government and others that have contributed to, I think, the situation that First Nations face today. So I don't think it's just Marianne who is putting forward the view that there's complicity in government and in society generally. We'll take another question at the back there when we have... right over here. Yeah, the gentleman with a black shirt. Are April? Okay. We'll let April decide.
Hi. I'm a yuksa as Nixnisip. Xamgeto Oxnack, Wilp Samogatlek, so Whitgui, Xamniska ni Getwin Xil, will Whitgui, Vancouver, will dog it. I'll switch to English now. My given name is Edna Nice. I come from the Nisga'a Nation, from the Nisga'a village of Getwinksik. We are the people of the lizards. In my introduction, I introduced myself as being, it's not gender appropriate, but saying the word Xim is just for the Nisga'a women only. That's a little bit of a lesson within using the Nisga'a language. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Ignace, for your presentation this evening. I've enjoyed it. By trade, one of the hats that I wear, I'm an early childhood educator, and I'm currently studying, I'm doing a master's in education at UBC, specializing in early childhood education. And part of my dissertation is going toward why we don't have fluent speakers today of children. It's 2015, and part of my research is looking at the nation, looking at the demographics and the statistics with regard to why our children are not speaking the language. And the other part of my research was, who were the last Nisga'a fluent children speakers? And I wandered around thinking that this could have been my mother's generation, but it wasn't. It was my older siblings who attended Indian residential schools, so it was that generation, so 2 generations ago. I was really trying to figure this out because it was really bothering me. Living in Vancouver, you look around, even in this room, I'm pretty sure that some of your families have fluent speakers as children, and even infant and toddlers. And living in Vancouver, I'm so envious when I'm out in public and I see parents and aunts and uncles conversing with their children fluently in their language, and I often wonder to myself, why are we doing that as Indigenous people? That's a part of my research, and I feel really strongly about this because at the beginning of your presentation noted that we are losing our elders at a rapid pace. And so the flip side of that are our children. And I've taken Nisga'a language training, and as an adult learner, it's a difficult language to learn. I'm not a product of Indian residential school. However, my generation are not speaking the Nisga'a language fluently because of that legacy. It's passed on to my generation. And now I've passed that on to my children's generation. But now I have grandchildren. And that's what compels me now to learn the Nisga'a language. I'm not a fluent speaker. I do understand it, and I speak it as much as I can. And I have a toddler. She's almost 2 years old now. And she responds to me in the language now. And I speak it to her as much as I could. But anyway, those are my comments. I don't want to take up a lot of time here. Is our children. I challenge you to raise a generation of speakers.
Marianne, do you want to respond to the prospects in terms of trying to inculcate the language amongst children growing up in, as has been suggested?
Yeah, sure. First of all, for your strong words. The children are our best hope. And as any of us or you who have had children, whether it's in French immersion or in some of our communities, we do have language nests. Children absorb language effortlessly compared to adults. And I agree with the speaker. Aboriginal First Nations languages are among some of the most difficult intellectual things on this earth to master. So starting kids young is a really good way to do it. We do need the critical mass of adults to run those language nests and immersion schools and all that. And that's why we're in a really kind of critical time period while with most languages still have some fluent speakers, elders, to help adults get as good as they can in their language in the best possible time. And I'm really gratified that you're working on that for yourself, your community, and your family. Thank you.
We took 2 questions from the front and 2 from the back. We'll close with 2 from the middle, and then we'll have a chance to talk amongst ourselves and ask Professor Ignace questions at the end of the reception. But be Avril, because I think there's this block of you can come halfway up and see and pick out someone whose hand is up in the middle of the audience. You choose it. Power to the microphone. There you go. Please stand up and just tell us who you are and pose your question.
Right. Hello. Thank you very much for your talk. My name's Samantha May, and I just finished my doctorate on language revitalization in Okinawa, Japan, where they also have a indigenous population with, trying to save their language before it's completely lost. It's in a different state, but anyway, I was wondering, you mentioned the story project where elders are sitting and creating new stories. So is that correct?
No, it's not new stories.
Not just old ones.
It's reclaiming old stories.
Okay. So when those are reclaimed, what happens with the stories? Are they used with the language nests? Or I was just curious about that aspect.
Eventually, we've been together with the elders group. We've taken them to the school kids. We have a First Nations school in our reserve community. So then telling them to the kids who hadn't heard these, that's what the illustrations are about, to have good visuals that will make them interesting and exciting. And we're in the process of kind of editing them into materials that then can be used in the school classroom with younger kids in the home. In the end, I think a really important thing is it's good to have them then in written form and in books, but stories need to be told. And so that's one other thing with a group of younger adults we're working on, is also to reclaim storytelling.
We'll go for one last question. Now, Heather's over there. Whoever is within arm's reach of Heather with a question or comment, right back there. Yeah. You could just stand up and put your comment.
Hi, my name is Tara Smith, and I don't have a doctorate or anything. I'm just here out of interest. I'm just curious. I mean, because you talk about like funding and all that kind of stuff, and I'm just curious how you promote and encourage like other like younger people to learn this language, and if it's possible to eventually maybe get funding somehow to become like to have bilingual schools and stuff. Like, how do you encourage that? Like, what's happening, like grants or like motivation or whatever? Like, do you see like more people getting interested in learning the languages?
Well, I think, yes, on the one hand, I see more younger people right now who are interested in learning their language than I saw 20 years ago or so, and I think that's a really good and a strong sign, although elders are passing on in front of our eyes. Money is obviously important, but it's not the only thing. I have to say the applying and then getting a $2.5 million SSHRC grant as a 7-year project has, through our network of different languages and communities, enabled us to kind of do stuff, and not in this year's sort of fiscal year cycle or something, but to kind of keep up some sustained work over a number of years, bring some young people in as student researchers, community workers, and so forth. So that definitely helps. I find as a mother, it's, once our kids are not so little anymore where they just absorb their language, but then they become rebellious teens who say, why do I have to speak that stuff? And eventually, into their late teens and into the labor market, it's really, really important that in our First Nations communities and in universities, institutions, we look ahead to give jobs to people who've learned their language. It's really, really important to reward them. And my daughter, who's 21 now, who, about 2-3 years ago told me she was hanging around with other kids on the reserve, and except for her sister and one other young man, nobody really kind of came forth to learn the language. But then she found employment, like during summer break and whatnot, to actually teach an immersion kind of summer camp and so forth. So she was saying to her friends, well, I'm getting employed because I know the language. And I thought about that. I think, but the bigger equation is we need to then provide jobs for those young people. First of all, enable them with whatever kind of monies and institutions we have to or can create to learn their languages. But the other thing is then we need to reward them with jobs in our communities.
Well, the purpose of SFU Public Square and the President's faculty lecture series is to give us an opportunity to discuss and hear about important issues to society from people who have special knowledge. And I think we certainly succeeded in having that kind of opportunity this evening. So please join with me in thanking Dr. Marianne Ignace for this opportunity. Now, before we adjourn, and there will be an opportunity if you want to join us for coffee at the back, and Marianne will be happy to try to answer questions. It's a wonderful turnout. I'm really heartened to see this kind of interest and the kind of questions and discussion have taken place. We will, through SFU Public Square and this series, have other opportunities too. So check the SFU Public Square website for other events and activities that take place throughout the year. The next President Faculty Lecture, very different topic, with Alicia Main on February 23rd at the Beatty School of Business, the Siegel Graduate School of Business at 500 Granville Street, and she'll be talking on turning invention into innovation, strategies for scientists, entrepreneurs. So I hope you'll join us for that. And please stay and participate in some further conversation on this very important discussion on the importance of indigenous languages and their preservation. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you.